Calling Annabeth Chase's family complicated is an absolute understatement. We got hints and details of her family around the first book and season of PJO, and we eventually got more and more information as the Riordanverse progressed. I've always found her family interesting, given their deep history with one another, and in this video, I thought it would be cool to go over the Chase family, its history, and what happened to each family member. Before getting into it though, there will be spoilers for PJO, Heroes of Olympus, The Trials of Apollo, and the Magnus Chase trilogy. There's going to be a lot of spoilers, so you've been warned. And with that, let's get into it. The Chase family is a very notable family in the Riordanverse, as they were known for their genius-level intellect and intelligence, which we see in members like Annabeth Chase, her father Frederick, and even Annabeth's uncle, Randolph Chase. As revealed in the Magnus Chase trilogy, the Chase family was involved in the different mythological worlds multiple times in the past. And what's even more interesting is that they were descendants of Vikings, specifically the Vikings of Kiev and Rus. And with this background, let's go over the Chase family we meet in the Riordanverse. Let's start with the adults of the family: Frederick, Natalie, and Randolph Chase. The three of them were siblings, with Randolph being the oldest, Frederick being the middle child, and Natalie as the youngest. They were the children of Mr. and Mrs. Chase, who were Annabeth and Magnus' grandparents, which is why we only know them as Grandpa and Grandma Chase. Going back though, Frederick, Natalie, and Randolph lived in the Chase family mansion in Boston, Massachusetts, which is the setting of the Magnus Chase trilogy. The three siblings were all pretty close growing up, even if they had pretty distinct personalities and lives, so let's go through them. Let's talk about Frederick Chase first, or the middle child, because his daughter is Annabeth, a character we all know and love from the PJO books. Out of the three siblings, Frederick was arguably the smartest, and I would say even a bit more than his brother Randolph. And that's saying something, because Randolph was also very intelligent as a Harvard professor. Frederick had a very good intellect, to the point that his brilliance even attracted the Greek goddess of wisdom, Athena. Athena was so touched by Frederick's pursuit for knowledge that she helped him get into Harvard University to really hone his intelligence. Frederick ended up excelling in college, and he even became a professor of military history, specializing in projects related to airplanes, wars, and even military weapons. Frederick had a genius-level intelligence that Percy described him looking like an excellent mad scientist in the Titan's Curse, and he even had an effective experiment with supernatural materials like celestial bronze. Frederick managed to make celestial bronze bullets, and they were very effective in killing monsters and anything supernatural. And he made this because he was aware of the danger the world posed to his demigod daughter. As Frederick studied in college, he and Athena became very close. And let's talk about their relationship. What Frederick felt for Athena is kind of complicated, because there's a bit of conflicting information from the books themselves. In the PJO series, we learn that Frederick and Athena's relationship ended well as a platonic romance, meaning they were just friends and nothing more. And that adds up, because that's how a lot of Athena's relationships are. Athena doesn't really do romance because she's a virgin goddess. However, she still has demigod children because she gives children as gifts to mortals she appreciates or admires. So, clearly, a platonic romance could have been the end of her relationship with Frederick. On the other hand, there's a very specific moment in the House of Hades that kind of goes against this. And let me explain. In this part, Annabeth is with her boyfriend Percy Jackson in Tartarus, and she remembers her dad in a very specific way, so I'll just read the excerpt to you guys. It reminded her of her own father. The few times he confessed to her that he still loved Athena, he had looked so sad and defeated, wishing for something he knew was impossible. The last part stuck out to me when I read it for the first time, because Frederick seems to be romantically in love with Athena, but at the same time defeated because he knows she doesn't do romance, and their relationship has been over for more than a decade at this point. So, I don't know. Does Frederick love her romantically or platonically? Let me know in the comments on what you guys think, but either way, we can deduce that he did care about her a lot. But this is when things get complicated. After Frederick graduated college, he was given the shock of his life when Athena gave him a baby Annabeth Chase. Frederick tried to tell Athena that this child was hers and not his, which is very much true if you think about it, especially once he realized that they weren't even dating at all. Like, okay, put yourself in Frederick's shoes right now. Imagine you just met this pretty cool girl in college, and suddenly, she just dumps a baby on your doorstep, even if she isn't your girlfriend, and literally nothing really romantic happened at all between the two of you. Like, looking at it now, Athena's kind of messed up for dumping a baby that Frederick wasn't ready for, so honestly, I really sympathize with him. Going back though, Frederick told Athena that she should raise Annabeth on Olympus, but Athena told him that mortal parents are the ones who take care of demigod children. And that was pretty much the last thing Athena told Frederick. Even if he wasn't ready to be a father, Frederick still decided to keep Annabeth in his home and raise her as his daughter. He was a single dad for 5 years until he met and fell in love with an unnamed woman. The two soon got married, and they had 2 kids together named Bobby and Matthew Chase. And just like that, Annabeth had a full family, but things were far from perfect. Although Frederick does love Annabeth, he wasn't the best father. Many fans try to debate about this because a lot try to defend Frederick and say that he was an unprepared single dad, so obviously he would be pretty bad at being a father, which I agree with. Frederick didn't want a child, but I don't think that excuses all of his actions. And let me explain. At this point, Frederick had a new family with his wife and 2 sons, and he overlooked Annabeth a lot. Actually, if you try to reread the Titan's Curse, specifically in chapter 16, we meet the dragon of eternal bad breath. Frederick seems to be a person so caught up in his work that he doesn't notice things. As established earlier, he's an incredible genius, but we see him slip up sometimes, like when he accidentally called out his son Bobby when it was actually Matthew, and then when Zoe talks about witnessing a specific battle Frederick was analyzing, Frederick was so caught up in Zoe's story that he forgot the fact that Annabeth was in danger around this time. The only reason he remembered Annabeth's situation was because Thalia Grace pointed it out to him. So clearly, Frederick may be a very big genius, but he overlooks a lot of things that I personally think his wife is the one who's really handling their marriage and the kids. So now, let's get context on how Annabeth's life was while living with her mortal family, because it's also very complicated. As a demigod, Annabeth was prone to monster attacks, especially since she's the daughter of Athena. Athena's enemy, Arachne, attacked Athena's children, and these spider attacks traumatized Annabeth. Annabeth tried telling her father and stepmother about the attacks, but they wouldn't believe her, because the evidence of the attacks went away the moment she tried to tell them. Because of this, Frederick and his wife told Annabeth that the attacks weren't real, and her stepmom even scolded her because she was scaring her stepbrothers. Now, with the context of Frederick being a very distracted but brilliant person, I think Frederick also overlooked just how little he paid attention to Annabeth, especially since he could have been more preoccupied with his wife and sons. It also would have escaped his notice, but Annabeth was miserable with a family that didn't understand her, and the only relative she was close to was her cousin, Magnus Chase. So at this point, let's get to Magnus' side of the family through Natalie Chase. Natalie, or Frederick and Randolph's sister, is the youngest of the Chase adults, and she had a pretty interesting life too, so let's get into it. Natalie was bold, brave, and full of life. Although she was raised in the same Chase mansion as Frederick and Randolph, she was barely there because she always went outside, especially in the wilderness. Her bright energy and love for the outdoors attracted the Norse god of summer, Frey. Frey and Natalie fell in love and soon had a son named Magnus Chase, making Magnus the 2nd demigod in the Chase family. Natalie and Frey had a very happy relationship, to the point that Natalie was okay when Frey eventually left them like the average godly parent. After he left, Natalie raised Magnus on her own, and she absolutely loved her son. In The Sword of Summer, or the first book in the Magnus Chase trilogy, Magnus talks about his mother, and how she often told him stories about his father while they were hiking or camping. Natalie taught Magnus survival skills, which would be very handy for him later on, because he would live in the streets after her death. And we'll get to her death in a while, because that happens much later. So let's pause with Natalie's family and proceed to Randolph Chase. Randolph Chase is the oldest out of the 3 siblings, and surprisingly, we don't know as much information about him before the events of the Magnus Chase trilogy, which is partly why I put him last. But what we do know is that as the oldest child, he was able to get ownership of the Chase mansion, and he's also pretty intelligent like Frederick. At some point, Randolph met a woman named Caroline, and they had 2 kids together named Emma and Aubrey Chase. Aside from this, Randolph was a history professor at Harvard, and he was obsessed with proving that the Norse gods were real, but his colleagues didn't believe him because there was no proper proof. Because of this, Randolph became determined to prove his claim, and that led him to the Sword of Summer. The Sword of Summer, or Sumerbrander, is a powerful weapon that belonged to Frey, but it went missing for many centuries. Randolph believed that if he got the sword, then everyone would finally believe him, and this led to some pretty risky quests. One of them even cost the lives of his wife and 2 daughters, and it happened like this. Randolph and his family were on a yacht searching for the sword when a storm came out of nowhere. A wave knocked them overboard, and his wife and daughters drowned in the bay. Randolph was the only survivor, and this haunted him for the rest of his life, which led him to do the things he did in the Magnus Chase trilogy. Randolph's life isn't over yet, but we have to pause here because there's a very notable event that happened to the three Chase siblings that changed everything forever. And let's talk about it. It all happened when Annabeth was 7 years old and Magnus was 6. It was Thanksgiving at the Chase family mansion, and the three families gathered together. The three adults started to talk downstairs, while Annabeth and Magnus went to Randolph's library. They played dominoes together, and Annabeth and Magnus had a pretty interesting conversation that I'll go over here. Annabeth had just stacked the dominoes in a miniature building, which references her love of architecture. As Annabeth stacked them, she told Magnus that he was lucky that he lived with his mother, because she was running away from home. Magnus wasn't fully able to process this though, because the adults downstairs were fighting. The argument got so bad that Frederick went to the library and told Annabeth that they were leaving. Annabeth told Magnus to stay safe, and that was the last time Magnus ever saw Frederick, Annabeth, and his uncle Randolph. And just like that, one Thanksgiving night broke the family apart. Magnus and Annabeth never knew why their families fought, but they were separated for many years. On Annabeth's side, that night of Thanksgiving made her realize that nobody understood or cared for her, as she lost the only person in her family that she felt connected to, her cousin Magnus. As Annabeth had told them in Thanksgiving, she ran away from home at just the age of 7. She went on the run, fighting monsters until she eventually met two Greek demigods named Thalia Grace and Lucas Stellan. Annabeth would soon arrive in Camp Haplid, and Frederick sent her letters to ask her to come back, but she refused. In one of those letters, Frederick had attached his old college ring, and although Annabeth had disliked her family, she kept that ring and honored her father through placing it in her Camp Haplid necklace. Annabeth would spend year after year in Camp Haplid, and I'm not going to go over everything Annabeth goes through in this video, because that would be a very, very long story. So if you want more on Annabeth, I actually made 2 videos discussing her life, which will be linked down below. But anyway, on Magnus' side, Natalie took Magnus away from her brothers. And what's interesting is that Natalie specifically told Magnus to never go to Randolph's house under any circumstance. Magnus didn't really understand why, but he knew it most probably had to do with whatever Natalie, Frederick, and Randolph were fighting about during Thanksgiving. Magnus had deduced that Randolph wanted something from Natalie, and Natalie did not want to give it, and that's why Natalie told Magnus to never trust Randolph ever again. And now, we can finally go to when Natalie died. It all happened when Magnus was around 14 years old. Wolves with glowing blue eyes attacked and killed her right in front of Magnus, and these wolves were sent by Fenrir Wolf, or Jotun who wanted to start the end of the world known in Norse mythology as Ragnarok. Fenrir did this to not only hurt Magnus, but make Magnus want to eventually get the Sword of Summer. This is because Fenrir is currently bound by ropes from the Norse gods, and a prophecy foretold that the Sword of Summer would one day free Fenrir. But going back to the main story, Natalie died trying to protect Magnus, and this event changed Magnus' life forever. Magnus started living in the streets, and he would do this for 2 years before the first book of his trilogy, The Sword of Summer. Now, I'm not going to go over everything that happened in the Magnus Chase trilogy, but I will reference events here just to explain what happens to each member of the Chase family. So, continuing this, The Sword of Summer opens to Magnus. He's now 16 years old, and he's living in the streets of Boston. In the first chapter, we learn that 2 people are looking for Magnus, and there is Uncle Frederick and his cousin Annabeth Chase. But before this, let's get context on why they're here. In the last Heroes of Olympus book, or The Blood of Olympus, which takes place before the Magnus Chase trilogy, we see Annabeth tell Percy about her cousin and uncle in Boston, the cousin being Magnus, and the uncle being Randolph. Annabeth explained how her uncle and father didn't get along, and this because of the huge fight during Thanksgiving. She thinks to herself that she wants to bring the family together, but knows it's a very hard task to do. However, everything changed just a few months later, as Randolph called Frederick up to tell him to look for Magnus, because Magnus has been missing for 2 years ever since Natalie died. Annabeth and Frederick were heartbroken after hearing this news, and they went to Boston and tried to search for Magnus. And now that you're all caught up, let's get back to the story. Magnus actually witnessed Frederick and Annabeth talk about him, and learned that his uncle Randolph was the one who told him about his disappearance. Added to this, Magnus was also very confused as to why Randolph was suddenly interested in him, especially since, as I explained earlier, Magnus' mother Natalie warned him to never go to Randolph's house. However, Magnus decided that he needed to get to the bottom of things, and this led him to Randolph's house. As Magnus wandered around for any clue of what Randolph was up to, Randolph suddenly appeared to him. Magnus and Randolph had a talk, wherein Randolph quickly explained to Magnus what's been happening. Magnus was a demigod son of the Norse god Frey, and as the son of Frey, that gave Magnus the right to take the Sword of Summer. Randolph's decade of research on the sword led him to appear in Boston, and Magnus successfully found the sword. However, they were suddenly attacked by a fire giant named Surt, who wanted to get the sword to start Ragnarok, and a fight happened. Magnus tried fighting bravely, but he was no match against Surt. In a desperate attempt to save the civilians around the place, Magnus threw himself at Surt so that both of them would land in the Charles River. This kept Surt from destroying the city, but at the same time, it killed Magnus. Magnus died in the first few chapters of his own book series, but this was just the beginning of his journey. Magnus' stand against Surt was a very heroic moment, and instead of being stuck in the realm of the dead, a Valkyrie named Samir al-Abbas believed that Magnus deserved a spot in Hotel Valhalla. Hotel Valhalla is a place for dead people called Einherjar. Einherjar, or in its plural form, Einherji, are people who were heroic in their final moments of life, and they're gathered in Valhalla for one purpose, and that is to fight during the end of the world, or Ragnarok. I've already mentioned Ragnarok earlier, but I'm saying it again. Ragnarok is the prophesied end of the world for Norse mythology, and the Einherjar are essentially the last line of defense for the Norse king of the gods Odin before the world ends. Which is why Odin needs these many heroes once this day comes. And that's also why the Magnus Chase trilogy centers around preventing Ragnarok from happening, especially since its villain, the Jotun Loki, wants to start Ragnarok. As Magnus does his adventures with his friends, his story sometimes crosses with Annabeth. After Magnus' death, a funeral was held for him, and Annabeth and Frederick actually attended. However, Magnus himself attended his own funeral, and it was a hilarious scene of Annabeth realizing that Magnus was dead, but also not really dead. Magnus tells Annabeth that he can't really explain much right now, but that he wants to talk more soon. He also hinted on the idea that he was on a quest to save the world, and as a demigod herself, Annabeth completely understood. Annabeth and Magnus became pretty close after this, as they actually met up a lot of times to talk about their lives, and this was a huge step for the Chase family, because this was the first time they really talked to each other after 11 years of separation. But speaking of their family, I also have to explain what happened to the oldest Chase adult, Randolph Chase. I left Randolph's story in a very tragic light. Randolph witnesses his wife and daughters die during his risky quest, and he was forever haunted by this, which brings us to Randolph's role in the Magnus Chase trilogy. This weak and grieving Randolph was a perfect target of the Jotun king Loki. Remember Loki? He's the guy who wants to start Ragnarok, and is the main enemy in the trilogy. And as heartbreaking as it sounds, Magnus was going to quest after quest, not just against Loki, but also his uncle Randolph. Loki manipulated Randolph through a big promise. Loki promised that he could bring back Randolph's family from the dead, if and only if Randolph agreed to help Loki start Ragnarok. Randolph accepted Loki's offer, and from then on, Loki used Randolph to get Magnus to get the Sword of Summer to free Fenrir. So skipping a couple of events here, I'll head to the highlight of Randolph's journey, the end of his life. Randolph dies in the second book of the Magnus Chase trilogy, or the Hammer of Thor, and to understand his fate, I'll give context. Around this time, Magnus had just prevented Ragnarok from happening, as he and his friends managed to keep Fenrir in his chains. Because of this, Loki decided to make another attempt to start Ragnarok, and this was his plan. So, just to give some more context on Loki, a long time ago, Odin, or the Norse king of the gods, had captured Loki and tied him up with indestructible ropes. And they're indestructible because they aren't really ropes. They were actually the entrails of Loki's sons. And what made it worse was that a snake would drip painful venom into Loki's face for all eternity. Loki was tormented by the snake for the next centuries to come, and his wife Sigyn tried easing his pain by catching the poison with a bowl every time it dropped. However, she would eventually have to empty this bowl, and that left Loki to feel the burning poison, and his pain and frustration apparently caused earthquakes according to Norse mythology. But anyway, given this context, Loki wants to get the hell out of there, and in order to do that, he needed to get another sword, specifically the ancient Skofnung sword, that can cut through pretty much anything. He needs them to cut through the entrails of his sons and free himself from this prison. Now, in the Hammer of Thor, Loki managed to trick Magnus and his friends into getting the Skofnung sword for him, and Loki made Randolph beg Magnus for the sword. After a fight, Magnus is forced to surrender the sword to his uncle, but as he does so, he tried to reason with Randolph. Magnus tells Randolph that Randolph's family had been dead for so long, and that instead of trying to retrieve something from the past, Randolph should focus on the present, especially since Randolph still has living family like Magnus himself, Annabeth, Frederick, and even to Frederick's wife and kids. However, Randolph disagrees and uses the sword to free Loki. This works, and Loki fled immediately because the Norse gods were arriving to arrest him. But this also meant that Loki pretty much abandoned Randolph to the mercy of Magnus and his friends. In the final fight against Loki's forces, Randolph gets knocked down next to a cliff that leads into Helheim, or the Norse realm of the dead. Magnus tries to reason with Randolph one last time, but Randolph doesn't listen. Instead, Randolph jumped into Helheim itself with the belief that it would reunite him with his family forever. And that's how Randolph's life ended. I don't know about you guys, but to me, Randolph's fate is by far the most tragic one we see in the Riordanverse, maybe even rivaling May Castellan or Luke's mom from PJO. But now with Randolph's death, that leaves Frederick as the last Chase adult. His siblings had died tragic deaths, but as Magnus had told Randolph, the remaining Chase family shifted their focus on what they had right now, and that was each other. And now, let's do a quick run-through of all of the Chase family members we meet in the Riordanverse. First, Annabeth Chase. Annabeth went on different life-threatening adventures with her boyfriend Percy Jackson, but she got a pretty happy ending. By the end of Tower of Nero, or the last book on the Trials of Apollo series, she and Percy started college together in New Rome University. Aside from this, Annabeth also enrolled in University of California, Berkeley, where she takes up architecture, or the field that she always loved growing up. Somehow, she studies in both universities, and she keeps in touch with not just her friends from Camp Haploid, but also through her family like Magnus and Frederick. Speaking of Frederick, we don't know much about what happened to him after his siblings died, but we can deduce that he was devastated by their deaths. On the bright side though, he's still surrounded by his wife and 2 sons, and also his daughter Annabeth, who keeps in touch with him every now and then after Annabeth decided to give him a second chance at being her father. It took time, but now Annabeth and Frederick's relationship improved tremendously. That in the House of Hades, or the 4th book of the Heroes of Olympus series, Annabeth even mentions how she and Frederick would often have heart-to-heart talks about their lives. Despite how close they are though, it is unknown if Frederick actually knows what happened to Magnus after Magnus's so-called death. Annabeth mentioned in the Sword of Summer that she didn't know how to explain Magnus's life to Frederick, so we don't really know if she actually told him or not. Either way though, if Frederick eventually understood what happened to Magnus, I feel like he'd be happy enough to accept Magnus into the family once more. Moving on, let's get a recap on Frederick's sister, Natalie Chase. Natalie used to be a bright and beautiful woman who loved the god Frey and her son Magnus Chase. She died protecting her son from Fenrir's wolfpack, and she will forever be missed by her family. Her brother Randolph, meanwhile, died trying to bring back his deceased family, and he fell victim to Loki's manipulation. Only Magnus and Annabeth truly understood what happened to Randolph, and it's still unknown if they told Frederick about the truth. What's interesting though is that in the Riordan Wiki, it stated that in the last book of the Magnus Chase trilogy, or the Ship of the Dead, Frederick was contacted by his brother's lawyers soon after Randolph died. To be honest, I don't really remember that specific detail from the book, but if this is real, then that means that Frederick actually knows about Randolph's death. But it's still unknown if he actually knew what happened or he just knew Randolph died. However, I can imagine that it must be devastating to hear his brother die. They may have ended things very badly in Thanksgiving, but he cared enough to show up in Boston in the first book of the Magnus Chase trilogy with Annabeth. And this was just because Randolph asked him to go, so clearly he still cares about his brother. And last but not the least is Magnus Chase himself. I saved him for last because I think his story closes the entire story of the Chase family. And for this, we had to go to the Ship of the Dead, or the 3rd Magnus Chase book. Here, Magnus defeats Loki once and for all during a flighting, and Ragnarok was prevented once again. By the end of the book, Magnus starts a romantic relationship with his best friend Alex Fierro, and the two of them take charge of the Chase Mansion, or the place Randolph had once owned all alone for so long. They turn the big place into a shelter for homeless kids, and it's a really sweet ending, especially since both Magnus and Alex were once homeless kids themselves, and they used this moment to help kids like them. Magnus also kept in touch with Annabeth a lot, and they shared stories with each other all the time, especially about their experiences being a demigod. By the end of the story, Magnus and Alex hold hands and look up at the sky to celebrate the 4th of July with the kids in the Chase Mansion. And there you have it. That's the story of the Chase family. They've always been such an interesting family with a rich history with one another. And although they had a fallout that separated the family for 11 years, their relationships with one another slowly improved with the help of Annabeth and Magnus keeping an open mind with one another. It was fun to go over each member's life story in the video, and speaking of that, how about you? Who's your favorite member of the Chase family? Let me know in the comments down below.